like shellfish.
Forget the Singaporean noodles. Joyce needs to make me this.
Oh no,
This
she
is
cannot.
what I
She does.
Okay. That died.
Oh, it's called carrot cake because I've heard this before.
That was
Yeah.
cool.
Are you back? Welcome back.
Okay. Hang on a second.
No. Law, food, and something.
Gotta switch rooms.
So
Okay.
I think what's super cool about Singapore is like the amount of street food is
Yes.
almost like it's more street food. To my understanding, it's more street food than it is restaurant.
Yes. The thing is that it's very much a hawker culture center in Singapore.
So what's hawker
Meaning-
mean? Like I've seen that every single time I look up Singapore food, like they're like hawker centers, and I'm like, what's a hawker?
Basically, in the past, when Singapore was just forming as a country, like 50 years ago, everyone was very poor, and they didn't really have much access to jobs in general. And since Singapore was a port country, there was a lot of different cultures here, and for one of the easier ways for them to make money was to sell their own food, their country's food here. So you have Malaysian, Indonesian, Indian food, and they would literally just sell it on the backs and like hawk out at people. Hey, we're selling this. We're selling mobile tools.
I see.
Such selling carrot cake. And then, but it got so bad that so many people were doing it that the government had to regulate it and say like, yeah, this is not sanitary. This is not helpful for everyone. Why don't we create central areas in each neighborhood? So each neighborhood has a hawker center that's like within a 2-5 minute walk.
Wow.
Even now it's like that.
Well, no,
And at these hawker centers, it's out in the open.
Korea has
But-
hawkers too, right?
Totally
Mm.
different.
Oh.
I feel like in Korea, there's still street food, but I still feel like the places where you can get street food is limited. In the sense of like, I can't just immediately walk out of my house and go to a street food place within a 5-minute walk. I feel like,
Okay.
versus in Singapore, it's like as soon as I walk downstairs, there's a restaurant.
Okay.
And
Well,
there's like places, it's also called go ahead.
no. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah, I know Vietnam and China and the other less developed Asian countries. Am I going to piss people off with that? Have a lot of hawkers.
Probably.
I know that Korea has hawkers too, but they're a little bit more organized than say the food merchants in the Southeastern Asian countries, right? They still sit inside these malls where they have their much more well-developed stalls than the Southeastern Asian countries, but I would still consider them hawkers. But in any event, that was kind of crappy that we missed that recording because I BSOD'd.
Actually, yeah, because what Matt was just talking about was really cool. I
Yeah,
didn't know 90% of that. That was cool.
Which
It's okay, I didn't know until earlier today too. even even my family didn't know.
well, I had planned on having Matt talk
You're
about.
frozen. 10.
Yep, give me 1 second.
Wait, hold on.
No, I mean, I can see you fine, Matt.
That's
10's
fine.
frozen.
Oh, no.
And now I can't hear him.
Give me a second. You'll hear me in a
Yeah.
second.
Yeah, sure. The bandwidth is low.
Food was a bad topic for us, I feel. We needed somebody who didn't care so much about food.
So wait, why is that? We missed it in the recording because my local computer is recording this. Why is food a bad topic for us?
Just because like we all love food so much. Like I think our perfect day would be going to a hawker site and just freaking trying everything we can until we realize we'd have to throw up in order to make more room, and then we would probably do it.
Yeah, that's the Singapore way right there.
And then we just go to the next hawker center the next day.
But
Yeah.
but food is life, isn't it? I know that some people view food as an obligation to live, but I think most people view food as culture, right?
Yeah.
You look at the Cajun, they have their food. You look at the southeastern Low Country, they have their soul food.
Several. Yep.
It just like we were talking about earlier with Rocky Mountain oysters, cow nuts, bull nuts, whatever you want to call it. That's food of the Western ranchers and the settlers back then because they ate every part of the animal because they didn't have an abundance of food, right? So what they had, they ate and they made the best of it. And though we may look at those types of food as something that we would otherwise scoff at, they were and are actually good tasting food. And I think even in Japanese and Chinese culture, where things like tripe, which is the stomach lining of either a pig or stomach, is something that would maybe turn the stomach of a person who is accustomed to eating just standard American food.
I've had it. It turns my stomach.
Everything turns your stomach. No, it does. Well, yeah, it's not for everyone though, right? Because food is not just about flavor; it's about texture. It's about the experience of the atmosphere where you eat the food and the people that cook the food for you and the interaction that you have with them. That's why we still go to restaurants and enjoy restaurants because we still can interact with the people that we dine with and the people that make food for us. We were talking about earlier as an inside joke about Hakuna Matata, but the three of us and our family and friends went to a Japanese restaurant and we bonded with the people there so much that we start singing Hakuna Matata with not just the restaurant, but with all the guests there.
Mhm.
But just to wrap up the Japanese food thing is that I think it's a stark contrast to authentic Chinese food, right? If you really want to get into authentic Japanese food and you're not comfortable with handling raw fish yourself, you're going to pay a pretty penny for it. And maybe the reason why you do that is not necessarily because the Japanese people think that their food is better than the Chinese people, but we're talking about raw fish here, right? We're talking about fresh raw fish and sometimes live specimens.
Oh,
So-
sea urchin. Oh, I would love to get sea urchin in the States.
So to experience Japanese food the way the Japanese people do, I think that there are two ways. Number one may not be reachable for everybody. That's spending the money on the restaurants that are importing food, next day air,
Yep.
flash frozen or fresh live food that you can taste it, and you're making reservations months out, or you get comfortable enough to go to somewhere like a Super H market or clean Asian grocery store that offers sushi grade fish and sushi grade seafood to learn how to make your own sushi.
Mhm.
Now,
Mhm.
here's the thing that I'm going to argue. I think you can watch YouTube and make an authentic Chinese recipe, regardless of the region, accurately. I don't think you can nail Japanese food on the first, second, third, or even the 10th try.
Yep.
It's not that easy.
100% agree with all of that. I think Chinese food is much closer to culturally how we view food that you can make it at home, whereas the Japanese food is so methodical that you can't pick it up not
So-
that quickly.
So I think Matt is really hitting Japanese food in plain sight. If you want to try authentic Japanese food to where it doesn't hurt your bank account, I think ramen is the way to go.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Like try different kinds and see how they differ. And if they all taste the same, if Maruchan is better at home, then probably not the best place to go.
Well,
Oh, and venture into fish.
and here's the thing, right? Is that think about like this, and I don't know how it was in Korean culture and how it was in Singaporean and Chinese culture. I know that in Vietnamese culture, we looked at pork belly as peasant food, and in the United States, we know cured pork belly as bacon, right? We don't buy pork belly as any other way because there's too much fat. But then all of these fine dining restaurants start picking up pork belly. Prices of pork belly start going up. But if you look at authentic Japanese food, and you look at tonkatsu ramen, which is tonkatsu's pork, and you look at braised pork belly with Japanese ramen, with ramen noodles that have never been frozen, with good tonkatsu broth, I think you can experience authentic Japanese flavors and Japanese food for under $20 for a family of four. If you're going out to a Japanese grocery store that's selling non-frozen Japanese ramen, you can buy pork belly, learn how to braise it yourself with the right ingredients, and you can really experience that in plain sight without spending too much. Sushi, I think that's off the table.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Sushi's off the table. And the cheap version of what you just said, get Maruchan. It's fine. Don't use the season packet. Use your own broth. And then in that broth, use stuff like the things that you can actually afford. So get oyster sauce. It's cheap. Get fish sauce. It's cheap. Make your own broth and throw in your own toppings. And the cool thing about ramen is that it doesn't have to be a certain kind of topping. It's literally whatever you want. It is a fridge dump kind of recipe, much like a stir fry. You got in your fridge, it's a bunch of veggies, throw it in there. Asian food isn't meat heavy. So the more veggies you have, the more authentic it'll be. So just try it. Put it in your fish sauce, put it in your oyster sauce, look for recipes online and go for it. Scrap the spice sauce, the spice pack, unless you get Mama. Use their spice packets. They're pretty good.
You make a really good point, Andy. You're
not sponsored.
You're talking about ramen fridge dump, which is 100% in line with Korean food.
I mean, it could be. I mean, that's what the kimchi pancakes are at the end of the day. It's how I make mine.
Army stew.
Well, Matt, you spent some time in Korea, and you're familiar with Korean food. Andy, obviously being Korean. What do you see in a Korean hot pot? They take fucking freeze-dried ramen and they put that shit in a hot pot. And that's authentic, right?
Exactly.
By the way, freeze-dried ramen from Korea is 10 times better than Maruchan. You can't even compare the two. So they're not even the same thing. So Andy and Matt, this is really your bit. Tell us about Korean food, how it came to the United States, where it is in the United States today, and really how you experience authentic Korean food.
Oh man! All right, where to start? Let's back up. Ramyun is not like the authentic kind of like China. Japanese ramen is probably, or ramen to Japan is probably like udon to Koreans. Different kind of noodle, very thick, very broth centric. But the noodle is much thicker. You tend to get less of it. But it's also often served with a lot of veggies, sometimes fried if it's special. A lot of times it's just, placed in there. It's udon itself is one of the dishes, and then you often have, even in a family setting, you'll have banchan, and banchan is going to be if you ever been to a Korean restaurant, you'll get several dishes before you get your actual meal. That's banchan. It sometimes has like a spicy cucumber in there. It's got the kimchi is always there, pickled radish, pickled potatoes, the whole 9 yards, the whole thing. So when you're thinking Korean food, don't try to think Chinese food or Japanese food. That's probably true for everything, but I don't want. There's so much Chinese and Japanese influence in Korean food that if you're looking from the outside in, you'll just say that's just Japanese food or that's just Chinese food. Like there's a variation of mapo tofu in Korea. There's a variation of ramen in Korea. There's a variation of just about everything you can find in every other Asian culture. South Korea is significant in that it is a melting pot of Asian cultures. And to think that it's not its own culture is disregarding like what it has to benefit to the rest of the world. So I'm going to start from there, and I will say that the thing you've heard about the most is kimchi, and the way that it's most often described is fermented cabbage. Most of the time, if you buy it in the United States, it's not fermented; it's pickled. In the sense that they just put vinegar, they wrapped it up in a bunch of red pepper, puts probably green onions in there, some garlic, whatnot, and onion powder, and they packaged it and sent it off to you. You probably got it 2 weeks after they put all the ingredients on there, dry packed it, put the vinegar in there, and said, "Here you go." So fermented in the sense that it's pickled, sure. Fermented in Korea, it's going to taste different. It's going to taste amazing. Best thing about kimchi, never goes bad. Sits in your fridge for 6 months, you could still eat it. Go ahead, Matt. That was my intro.
Well, hang on. I'm going to ask Matt a question real quick after I say something to Andy here. Is that, you know, we do experience kimchi in the United States where it's not really pickled, right? They kind of accelerate the process because in Korea they bury the kimchi in these clay pots. And they actually ferment the kimchi, whereas in the United States, I don't know whether it's to meet demand or whether our FDA won't allow burying clay pots of cabbage in the ground. I don't know. So, Matt, I'm going to pass this off to you because I think you're more attuned with authentic Korean food than Andy will ever be because he doesn't eat sundae. And I think that's a problem because
so amazing.
Because when it comes to sundae and because now we're talking about authentic Korean food, right? One of the things that I asked you guys before you got into it, Andy, was that, you know, the contrast and difference between American Korean food versus authentic Korean food. You can't walk into a K restaurant. Is that a word now? There's a word now. A K restaurant.
K-pop is, so yeah, why not?
And order sundae. That's not something that we find on the menu. So Matt, why don't you give us your experience of why you were in Korea, what you experienced in Korea, and how that food relates to what you experience in America and how people can experience authentic Korean food in the United States, which, by the way, we'll give Andy another chance on authentic Korean food in the United States after this, because
Well, I was in the Air Force for 4 years, and I just happened to got lucky to be stationed in Korea at the time. But I kind of lived in the boondocks of Korea. I didn't really live in the city. And my base, my home, where I used to live at, was fairly small. And I didn't really care for the people too much on my base. So I tried to make friends with the local Korean nationals. And I would go out volunteering at different places in the city. And I would just try and experiment. I just like, hey, wherever you want to take me, you take me. And I felt that Korean food has a lot of flavor to it. It's not always spicy, but most of the time it's spicy. But I felt like there was such a variety within Korean dishes that almost any type of meal that you want over there was always very nice. And there was always street foods close by, not super close by, but there was places where they serve only kimbap. And they have whole big variety of different types of kimbap that you can want.
What is that?
And it's a bit similar to kimbap.
What's kimbap?
Kimbap is a bit similar to sushi rolls, but with kimbap, the seaweed is on the outside with rice on the inside and filling such as
Oh, okay. Hang on a second. As an American, I'm confused
what's that?
because when
As an American,
I-
you should be confused. So I'm going to interject just a little bit here.
Yeah.
Kimbap. We use kim as opposed to nori. The difference between kim and nori is that nori uses a different kind of seaweed, and it uses a lot more of the fried and pressed kind of methodology to create what the seaweed is. The kim that Koreans use is actually fried to the point that it's crispy. So we put it on the outside because if you put it on the inside, it gets really soggy and much more akin to what actually seaweed is in the ocean. So it's on the outside of it to keep the crunch when you have the kimbap. On the inside of kimbap, it's an array of things. Like if you go to Korea, the thing that Americans will get to most is the ones with spam inside. So there'll be spam, there'll be cucumber, there'll be carrots, there'll be kimchi sometimes, things like that. Spam is a huge thing.
wait, hang on a second.
Yeah.
What the fuck is kimbap? Because you guys are saying sushi and spam in the same sentence. And what's kimbap?
At the end of the day, you're talking about a very specific kind of seaweed mixed with a less sugar-esque kind of rice with
It looks like
veggies,
sushi, right?
Veggies and meat, and
It looks
sometimes
like
inside the
sushi.
crab meat.
It looks like sushi, right? Is that what we're getting to? It looks like maki rolls. Is that right?
If a sushi burrito looks like sushi, then yeah, this kimbap also looks like sushi.
Let's give these listeners some context. If they never had kimbap before, what is kimbap? I mean, you know, I was at Super H, which is a Korean grocery store the other day, and we looked at kimbap. My kids were like, "Hey, is that sushi?"
Oh God, I feel bad for your kids. All right,
No, it's
so
not.
so kimbap significantly will have daikon radish, pickled daikon radish. Pickled daikon radish is a yellow square-looking thing inside the rolls.
Hang on. It looks like sushi though, right?
No,
No, it looks like a sushi roll, doesn't it?
it looks like sushi
Right.
as it looks like all of us came from the same country.
Right. And that's the thing, though, right? Is that okay? Look, let's put all of this into context. And I'm sorry, Matt. I'm going to give this back to you in a second. I don't want to steal this from you. Is that when we're talking about kimbap, is that something that is American Korean? I don't think it is. Right. I think you can get into Korean grocery stores and certain restaurants in the United States and find kimbap.
Yeah.
But if you never stepped foot into those restaurants before and you saw kimbap, the first thing that would come to a patron's mind is this is sushi. It's not sushi. Okay. And I think Andy is starting to distinguish the difference between kimbap and sushi, but I want to kind of bring this to light because remember, this isn't supposed to complicate the process of eating. This is supposed to say, okay, well, look, this is really in your back door. And why is this different? Why is it worthwhile to change the things that you're doing right now?
I see. You're wanting to go the other way. All right. So the difference between sushi and kimbap is that sushi actually encourages the use of raw fish. There is no raw fish in kimbap, and there never is.
That's what I'm looking
Most of the time, we're looking at what we call artificial crab meat, and it's artificial. So we're not really looking at crab meat. So you can get kimbap with actual crab meat, but most of the time we're talking about
Kanikama in Japanese, right?
yeah. But I'm trying to remember what the kind of fish it is. It's a very
it could be
pollock. Yes. And it's got a red dye on the end of it, and that's the red that you see in there. There's no crab in there. It's literally just a cooked fish, and it's usually boiled or steamed, and it's kind of stringy.
It's really good.
Yeah,
though.
it's delicious. You can have it fried, and that's a meal by itself. You can have it with cream cheese, but if you do, you're a loser. But it's amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Matt.
Very
Matt.
fine.
Sorry, Matt. So kimbap. Now that we've taken the long route on defining what kimbap is, why don't you give us your experience with what Korean food was like in the United States versus what Korean food was in Korea, and why and how to identify finding that authentic Korean food, or whether if that Korean food that's being presented to us in the United States is authentic but abbreviate in a manner, right?
Right. The few restaurants I've been able to find in my area, um, it was close to authentic, but I always felt there was something off about it. And I'm used to in Korea where the quantity of food was pretty large, but whereas in the States, it was smaller portions. Not for me, it wasn't very satisfying. And but it wasn't until I went into Chicago, right, in the bigger metropolitan area, where I was able to find, neighborhoods that had a whole variety of Korean restaurants and stores in supermarkets. And there I felt the food was pretty close to authentic, I felt like, but it was still pretty tasty. And I was able to actually find or what Joyce was able to find a Sundae restaurant. Or it was all Sundae.
Oh,
Oh, it was amazing.
No,
God.
I bet it was.
Can you explain
Yeah.
what Sundae is? Just since you actually like it, you won't give terrible names for it. So you want to explain what Sundae is for the listeners?
I don't I never fully questioned it
It's a blood
because
sausage,
I feel
It's a
yeah,
fucking blood
it's a blood
sausage, okay?
sausage.
This is why you
Right.
like
Yeah.
it. This
Right.
is
Yeah.
why you like
The
it.
thing is, when I first had it in Korea, I didn't even know what I was eating. And whenever I ask someone, they're like, "Don't question it, just eat it."
It was
It's a
good.
bit like yeah, it's good. It was a bit like a hot dog in that way, where you just don't question it, you just eat it, and it tastes nice.
Definitely
And fish
doesn't taste
cake.
like a hot dog. Tastes nothing like
No,
a
it doesn't taste like a hot dog. No,
Right.
it tastes nothing like it, but it's all the random bits and pieces of animals.
I
that
will
was
say
put
it's
into
not
it.
terrible,
animals?
but yeah, of animals.
Wait a
Yeah.
minute. Random bits and pieces of animals. Can you really tell us what random bits and pieces of animals? Because I'm sitting here, I've had sundae before, and I'm sitting here thinking it's just a blood sausage with rice, and now you're telling me
I don't
it's
know.
random
I
bits of
just never
animals.
question it. I just
Okay.
always
All right.
equate it. Yeah. I just know that it's yeah, go ahead.
Maybe-
It's what you said. It's blood sausage and rice with Kim on the outside,
Well,
and
right.
a lot of the time it's fried. Not a lot of time. I don't know, probably half and half. I don't know. Matt can correct me. It's a lot of time it's like battered, fried, and then they'll throw it into soups or as a side dish.
Yeah.
so I
And
like
it's usually
steamed.
it's in a very long tube shape.
Matt,
And
Matt, it's called a
yes.
sausage. Yeah, it's called a sausage. We have a word for that in the United States. It's called a sausage.
Really? Huh.
Right.
It's been
But
so
they'll,
long.
they'll cut it up. They'll cut it up.
They'll cut it up.
They'll cut it up. It's worth trying. Just don't make it your meal. Like
No, it
Get
really
it
is.
as
Good. No, it's
They
great.
just don't question it, just eat it.
Okay. So what about Korean barbecue, Matt? So let's look at Americans and Korean food. Korean barbecue is extremely popular in the United States. How's that compared to the general foods that Korean people eat in Korea?
To be honest, I tried looking in my area for Korean barbecue, but I could not find it, to be honest. I
That's
probably could find it.
correct.
Huh?
which
What's
is
that?
correct because Korean barbecue is a like specialty and it's not held in high regard because it's a ton of meat. And Asians don't typically eat a ton of meat. Americans do, which is why Korean barbecue is so huge here, but not huge in the Asian countries. Sorry, I just wanted to put that in there.
No, it's fairly, at least in Singapore, it's fairly big here, I would say.
Korean
Meat
barbecue?
or Korean barbecue?
Korean barbecue, there's like
Oh, you said you couldn't
specific.
find anything.
Oh no, I was sorry. I meant more in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Oh.
Yeah, we were
That
talking about
makes
in the
sense.
States.
So-
Yes.
So here's the thing. I think I think Korean barbecue is the best entry to not fast food Asian food for Americans. I think it's the
Unfortunately.
closest thing to what our palates are used to in the United States, that people can go to a Korean barbecue in the United States and experience the fermented soybean, the fermented chilies. Is that what it is that you guys use, Andy? Uh, and really taste what Koreans taste, which is a bland mix of hot soybean
No,
and pickles.
no,
No,
God, no.
no. Did I
Alright,
get that wrong?
You're killing
Did I
my
get-
soul.
Did I get it wrong? And soju.
I don't even know where to start with this.
You know when okay, so you guys can attack me on this, but when I think of Korean food, man, miso paste, throw it on my meat, my bacon, my hamburger, whatever it is, I got Korean. Throw that. What's that bread?
Gochujang.
Yeah, whatever it is. Throw it on my hamburger, my hot dog, my corn dog. I got Korean. If I want to make sushi without fish, I got Korean.
Oh,
Oh,
okay. So let's take a step back. Authentic Korean. If I had to pick a dish, if I had to pick a particular style of dish to say, hey, this is like Korean food, I'm probably going to pick a guk. Guk just means soup. There's several ways of talking about soup in Korea, and I think it's huge. So you have guk, you have jjigae, and you have that one that translates to stew that I'm forgetting right now, but they have different ways to describe kinds of soup. If I'm going to introduce somebody into Korean food, I'm probably going to like authentic Korean food. I'm probably going to tell you to try sunabuguk.
but that's the
Sunabuguk.
But that's the thing. You're not talking about authentic Korean food, right? But what I was referring to was that what I know as Korean American food. When I go into Korean soups, where we're talking about braised tofu, and the soups of Korea is probably my favorite. You know, I grew up eating pho, which I'm Vietnamese, and pho is known as one of the best soups in the world. But when I eat Korean soup, when I go to a Korean restaurant and am able to order something along those lines, it is fantastic. It is some of the best foods I've ever tasted in my life. But when you're talking about American Korean, we think about Korean barbecue, right? Korean barbecue has almost been subjected to the same, I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for Korean food, but as Japanese hibachi. This is that. Yeah, right. But the thing about Korean food is that, you know, when you go get Korean barbecue, you get these amize or little plates of different types of pickled vegetables, and you get to taste these different types of vegetables. And I can guarantee you that if you give them to Americans, that they'll skip the seaweed and maybe even the bean curd and some of the other things, and they'll eat the kimchi, the rat and the cabbage. But when we're talking about the difference between US Korean, authentic Korean, that's where I'm trying to draw the line, right? Is that okay? If I'm living in Woodstock, there's a place called K-pop barbecue. Literally K-pop barbecue. They're playing K-pop music, doing Korean barbecue, drinking soju, and nothing else. I can't order Korean soup. If I go into some place that is in a Korean town district, I can get the Korean soup, and the foods are fundamentally, from a taste perspective, very different, and even ingredient perspective, very different. So when we're getting into this conversation about being in plain sight, if I'm living in Woodstock, I can go to K-pop and experience something that is very close to my American palate, and it's very cool. And I'm thinking hibachi, right? Is that hibachi is really cool because these chefs are doing tricks and cooking in front of me in Korean barbecue restaurants.
So what I'm understanding from your question is, how do I go from an American palate and venture outside into an area that I'm unfamiliar with?
How do you identify authentic Korean food, and how do you learn to enjoy Korean food when your palate is locked down to a certain type of flavor?
I think you should probably lock down that flavor, mainly because I think most Americans view Korean food. I think most Korean barbecue that people will think about from our listeners in the states is going to be bulgogi,
Sure.
bulgogi and galbi, and it's got a crap ton of sugar. The American palate has this thing for sugar that is just unreconcilable. But if you want that sugariness, I would recommend actually going to a Korean bakery. You'll have one in a 4-hour radius of you. I guarantee it. It's huge in the United States now. It's getting bigger and bigger. You probably have a Paris baguette around you, and despite its name, it's actually a Korean bakery. Korean bakeries, Korean bakeries are very different. When you walk in there, you're going to notice like it looks like a buffet style. There's trays, there's tongs, and everything looks super sweet. And all of a sudden, you get to this croissant that has hot dogs and cheddar in it. And that's how you know you're at a Korean bakery. To be honest with you, I would recommend trying things outside of your palate and trying things that you recognize. So try the strawberry shortcake, for example. It's not going to taste like anything you've had before. It's going to be sweeter. It's going to be more decadent. It's going to be a lot more of an emphasis on the strawberry.
I think you're selling our listener short. We're talking about
Okay.
soup that you were getting into. And Matt,
I mean, you're asking me to get from like Korean barbecue
Okay.
into something.
Yeah, right. Getting Korean barbecue into authentic Korean flavors. I think it's a disservice to tell them to go to a bakery and eat a fucking corn dog or a hot dog. I've eaten it. It's really fucking good. It's really good, right?
But it is Korean food. And
I was about to
No,
say
it-
it is
no.
authentic Korean food.
No,
When you
no,
go to a
it's-
Korean
That's a
bakery,
huge. It's Paris baguette is pretty huge. in Korea.
It's really good, but you know, that's saying that's telling somebody to come to the United States and going to the hot dog stand and grabbing a Chicago dog, right? Chicago dog is amazing, but you know, it's not the same thing as shrimp and grits. Different
I-
foods, very fundamentally different foods, but when you're talking about the soup that you were getting into, Andy and Matt, you know
I
these
think-
soups too, right?
I think
Right.
Matt and I are having a problem because we're trying to figure out what exactly you want, because we can get into a ton of different kinds of foods.
Well,
Like,
I'm
if you
trying
want
to
to talk about
I'm
soups.
trying to get you guys to not talk about your fucking little Debbie's in Korea. And talk about
They're okay.
really-
So go to a Korean bakery. Don't let this guy like sway
Yes.
you away. It is very different, like very, very different. The cultural experience, the whole 9 yards. Try the coffee. Everything is different.
I would say that,
Um,
you know, when Joyce came to, because we had Paris baguette in Singapore, and when Joyce came to the States and she had a big craving for bakery types of food, she could not find what she wanted here or find it in the States. It wasn't until we found that Paris baguette in Chicago that she was like, yes, finally proper bakery
Right?
food
Yeah.
that she likes. You know,
Mhm.
it's different, you know.
It's very
I
different.
think it's worth trying.
It's
and-
and it for the amount of knowledge that we have in bakeries, it takes the sweet out of it. It's like once
Right.
you start seeing like, wait a minute, a tomato croissant, like this is weird.
Or
Try it.
pizza croissants.
Yeah, like the whole 9 yards. It's different from any other experience you've ever had in every bakery, and I can guarantee that. Like, hop into any Korean bakery, look for it. Look for a Korean bakery. There's no such thing as a non-authentic Korean bakery in the United States right now. I put money on it.
And you got to look
Yeah.
for Korean spicy fried chicken too, right? It's not the same thing as your.
So that's harder to find in the
Yeah.
states.
Well, you know-
Korean chicken is harder to find in the states.
Okay, so here's the thing: Japanese and Chinese food are things that you can really convince our listeners to go eat because it's there, right? Korean food, I think. Korean food and the rest of the foods that we'll talk about for the rest of this episode are really novelties in our culture as Americans. Why should somebody go out of their way, Matt, to eat Korean food in the United States?
I will say that, you know, growing up in the small town of Hinesville, Georgia, that I didn't really have much variety in my diet growing up. and I just accepted whatever food came my way, and I enjoyed it. But it wasn't until I met with Andy and some other Korean friends and had food from their families that I was like, wow, there's other flavors out there. You know, there's something that I can really enjoy eating. It like kind of like broadened my whole world perspective on what food
I feel
can
like
be
you had
like.
omu rice at my house back in the day in high school.
Say again.
I
What
feel like you
rice?
had omu rice in
Yes.
middle school or high school or something. I forget now.
Yeah.
And by the way, that's just an egg omelet with rice, right?
Yeah, and it's Japanese, and it's not okay. So this is going to be different. This is actually a Japanese dish. It's no different in Korea, like no different at all. But yeah, it's. I agree with Matt to an extent. I don't know if Matt knew about the hole in the wall Korean grocery store that was in Hinesville. But it
No.
was it was
Oh
it
yes,
was
yes, yes. It was
yeah,
very, very small. Yeah. By
it,
the
it
base. Yeah.
was tiny, and there was actually a restaurant attached to it,
Yeah.
and like there only Korean people really showed up there, and it was amazing food. It's great food, and I want to go back to the original intent of this, and that's to say how to find authentic Korean food. Find a Korean grocery store, even if it's H Mart. They will serve Korean food cooked. uh it doesn't matter if they don't say, hey, we sell Korean food. If it's a Korean grocery store, ask them, like, do you have any prepared foods that are like cooked, that are ready to go? They will have something. I've never been to a Korean grocery store that doesn't have it, and they're all hole in the wall places that sell good Korean food. You
So,
want to try authentic, go to a Korean grocery store.
life pro tip: if you're a college student, you live by Super H Market, you can live off more than ramen. You can go to Super H Mart
Yeah.
and get free samples without having to pay for
Yes.
your food every single day, and have a very good lunch and good dinner, and not have to just eat ramen. Um, the by the way, the rice omelet, many people don't know this, but if you eat a rice omelet with ketchup, it's the bomb.
Oh, it's amazing. I do all of my omelet rice like that.
It is amazing. Matt, so with your experience in Korea as an Air Force veteran and spending time being based in Korea, you know, one of my friends who flew for the army was based in Korea, and his wife always complained that when she went out, all she found was Korean barbecue, which both of you guys said, hey, that's kind of a specialty, right? She didn't find the soups. She didn't find is it bibimbap, right?
Bibimbap.
And
I'll be bibimbap.
yeah. So when what makes Korean food valuable for somebody who is accustomed to eating Asian food as Panda Express to go out and try something like sundae or bibimbap or kimbap or any of these other things that Korean food has to offer that they were never presented with before. Because look, a croissant with a hot dog in the middle of it, I think any American can eat that, right? Right.
No, you need to try it.
It
It's
is
not
nice.
what you're expecting.
No, I love it. Yeah. So what's the deal, Matt?
I feel like Korea has some unique flavors that you wouldn't normally get to enjoy from other cultures. I mean, there are similarities with other, China and Japan, but it's different. And they like to use a sauce or spice called gochujang, which is like a red peppery paste that they mix in while they're frying the food.
Thai chili
And-
peppers for anybody interested.
Hey, you
Oh,
want to know?
sorry.
You know what's peppery? Because it's peppers.
Appreciate it. But and then that with mixed in with kimchi and fried rice and veggies, and I think that you wouldn't get to experience that probably in, well, I want to say that, I wouldn't say that, take that back. But it has a unique flavor and taste to it and texture as well.
I'm going to
about
jump
you?
in and say that I think it's unfair to try to say Japan and China and like what makes it different, because what I would say would flip the script. and we were talking about Vietnamese very quickly. I think what makes Korean special is that it actually has all these cultures. So I say Vietnamese because there's so many types of flavors that are just about pickling the vegetables, and preserving those vegetables and carrying it for a long period of time. Like, keep in mind the generation before, well, I don't want to go into a whole historical lesson. So the pickling of the veggies is almost in every flavor that you're going to get outside of soups. You'll have the daikon radish pickled. You're going to have pickled bean sprouts, which there's different kinds of bean sprouts. The pickled bean sprouts you'll get in Korea are called mung beans, M-U-N-G, mung beans. And you can probably get at your local grocery store, and you can probably do the pickling yourself with a little bit of sesame oil. You're going to get pickled cucumbers. You're going to get pickled cabbage. It's so much about pickling that it's a lot closer to southeastern US kind of fare than you would say is close to Japanese or Chinese. And I say that because pickling is a worldwide kind of phenomenon, right? So Vietnamese culture too, I assume we'll get to that eventually, is a lot about the pickling too. And you get a lot of that pungent flavor that comes out. Go ahead.
It's crazy, okay? Because we're all from Southeast United States. Us, our friends, white, black, yellow, whatever it is, they pickle a lot of shit, but they don't know what it tastes like. They just pickle it because they're preparing for that day that they need to eat that pickled shit, right? Because you look at it with pickled okras.
Oh god.
You either put it in Bloody
Good.
Mary,
Yeah.
or you're gonna wait till Doomsday, right?
Yep.
So you know, when we're talking about American pickles, there's only one pickle that we love here in the United States. That's cucumbers, and pickle is synonymous with pickled cucumber in the United States. When you say, "Hey, I just had a pickle," you don't think about I just ate a pickled olive or a pickled okra. When I say, "Hey, I had a pickle with my burger," you're thinking about a pickled cucumber, right?
That's
When
right.
you're talking about Asian food and you're saying, "Hey, I just had a pickle," I don't know what the fuck you're talking about, man. You could have had kimchi, you could have had pickled ginger, beni shoga, or you could have had pickled mustard green from Vietnam, or you know, there's so many different pickles that we eat in Asian culture that's kind of, we juxtapose the flavor palette, right? Is that we go from foods that are fresh and we eat them together with foods that are pickled. And it's a good juxtaposition with our flavor palettes to say, okay, well, you know, something that is not sour with something that is sour is actually good. It may not be umami. Matt, you don't need to sleep. Shut the hell up. We're about to wrap up. But in any
It's
event,
5:40 a.m. Don't you
Yeah.
need to wake
So-
up here soon?
you're right.
Yeah,
So,
I teach at 9,
in any event,
2 hours.
I think you guys do make a good point. Is that, well, number one, Koreans, I think Koreans eat more pickled vegetables than perhaps most other Asian countries. I know the Japanese eat a lot of pickles as well, but Koreans, you guys fucking pickle everything, right? Beyond Korean
Vegetables.
barbecue, getting into the other Korean foods are amazing because they are, from a flavor and a palate perspective, very much different from what we're used to tasting. We'll make an argument about that later before Matt goes to bed. But, you know, from a plain sight perspective, is that even Americanized Korean food is very different from Japanese and Chinese food. That if you go out and taste Korean barbecue or Korean hot pot, that it is something that is still very good. Who are you asking? You can ask this on the podcast because we're not
Oh.
editing it. Nobody's
How long
listening
you
to it.
got, Matt?
Yeah.
I got another 10 minutes.
Okay. All right. We'll
How
wrap
how
it
long
up.
do you realistically have, Matt?
Oh, that's fine. It's because I teach at 9 a.m. I have 5 classes at 9, and
What
it's
is it,
5
13-hour difference right now?
It's 5:41 a.m. right now.
Oh, then you don't need to sleep. You're fine. You slept 4 hours last night.
I have a
Matt,
lot of classes tomorrow
why,
or
why,
today.
Matt, why'd you wake up at 3?
Who
Um,
works on Monday?
yeah. So look, it- I'm not going to talk too much about Vietnamese food. Here's the thing I can say about
Oh,
Vietnamese
you
food.
should. Well,
You-
at least tell us how to find authentic Vietnamese food in the States.
But well, that's the thing is that you go into inside a Vietnamese restaurant, everything you get there is nearly authentic. It's just a very small.
You're telling me that
amount-
I can go anywhere and get a banh mi.
Well, so if you go get a banh mi in any Vietnamese restaurant, it's pretty close to being authentic. Now, that's because, again, look, if you go to Subways, you can choose your cold cup Subway to be made however you want. So you can choose your banh mi made however you want. So if you want to leave out the head cheese or the pate, you can do that, right? It's still authentic. But here's the thing about Vietnamese food is that with Vietnamese people, we never had to open restaurants to appeal to a crowd based on the ingredients we had. Everything that we cook inside Vietnamese restaurants are ingredients we have back in Vietnam that we can cook here. The thing is that we don't get too far into the Vietnamese cookbook is because it doesn't match our palate here in the United States. We make pho, we make fried rice, we make banh mi, we make things that are very palatable to Americans. Because look, when you're eating pho, pho is really good with tripe. But even yourself, Andy, who you're Asian, you don't like tripe, you don't like sundae, right? And the thing is that it's not affixed to the palate of a certain type of people. I think that there are people in the United States. Where did Rocky Mountain oysters come from? They came from the United States.
Texas.
Most Americans won't eat Rocky Mountain oysters, right? So I think it's fair to say that when we look at authentic food, Korean food that we experience now in the United States, Vietnamese food that we experience now in the United States, anything that's not Thai, Japanese, or Chinese, we're looking at Filipino, we're looking at Vietnamese, looking at Korean, looking at Matt, I wanted to give this to you if you don't have to leave too soon. I want to talk about Singaporean food. Is that any of these other Asian descent food that are now becoming mainstream in the United States or coming close to it are more authentic than anything we ever had before in the Asian foods that have been offered here in the United States. They're not everything that we have to offer in Korea and in Vietnam because we grew up with much different foods, even though we touch on Korean barbecue, pho and bun and banh mi and, all these other things that we eat at home. But there are other foods that we eat at home that we don't find in restaurants, right? But the same thing can be said true about American food. There are American foods that are made at home that can't scale on the restaurant level, that we don't see that. But in any event, Matt, I want to ask you this. From a person who now lives in Singapore, I can't find a Singaporean restaurant in the United States. I don't even care to find a Singaporean restaurant in the United States. What are we missing out on?
A lot.
A lot.
Keep talking.
The thing is that the thing that makes Singaporean food unique is that, like I mentioned earlier before to Andy, is that Singapore is a port town, and a lot of people from a lot of different cultures transit within Singapore really often. And a lot of people, when they will come to Singapore, they'll be homesick, so they want food from their own cultures. So Singapore food has become like a hodgepodge or a melting pot of a lot of different cultures. So you get pretty much anything you want in the world you can find in Singapore. But a lot of the biggest influence is
Tell me
Malaysian.
what's Singapore food? Like, how would you describe it?
It's hard to pinpoint. Because the thing is about Singapore food is that it's so diverse. When you go to hawker centers, and a hawker center is a place where it's outdoors and with a rooftop, and each restaurant is almost as small as a bathroom. And they just, you see a old uncle or old auntie just cooking the food right there, and just like, here you go, here you go, here you go, and right there, and you can actually develop a relationship with them
So we were
if you
talking
go
about
there
this a
often
little bit
enough.
earlier, and hawker center is probably the number of what we would call street food, which is what the hawker center I think is like made up of. The number of street food outnumbers probably the number of sit-in restaurants.
Oh, yes.
Is my understanding, and then on top of that, Singaporean food is probably the idea of the eat and go. Would you
Yes.
agree with that? Like the hey, here's food, let's get it, go. Like, would you say that food is more meal based, or is it kind of like tapas, like in Spain, where we're having like small bites fairly often?
It's a mix of both, because the thing is about hawker centers is that it's like a center for everyone. So you have older folks who will come to hawker centers and they would just chill, drink beer, and just stay there all day and talk and hang out. And or you have business folks, they'll go to their local hawker centers and they're just, like you said, eat and go back to work. But the thing is about the culture here in Singapore is that um, it's food is their culture. Like there's not too many activities for Singapore to do because it's so small. So as people are eating, they will talk about, okay, what are we going to eat next? A few hours later, what are we going to eat tomorrow morning? Even when they're stuffed, even for us, I feel like even when we're stuffed, it's like, oh man, I don't even want to think about food. For them, it's like constantly on their mind.
So
And it's like, it's a bit,
how is food served? Do you like, if I went to a hawker center with you, would I be like, hey, you know what? Give me the number four. Give me the Singaporean noodles, and I'm going to eat that myself.
something,
Or do I bring it to the table and we kind of like
something
share
similar.
it?
So something similar, you go to the hawker center with your family, and at least with my experience with Joyce's family, um, everyone goes to the hawker center and then they split up.
Mhm.
Each one goes to different hawker stalls because each stall tends to specialize in a few dishes, and the dish size tend to be on the bigger size, but you can get smaller portions as well. But so Joyce's family, they will get a whole bunch of dishes, and they're just go to the tables, and they're large and circular, and the table will just be full of food. And as every man for themselves kind of thing, where everyone's just sharing from different plates,
Family stuff, right?
and
And I think this is important to note that outside of Japan, I believe this is normal for most Asian countries.
yes,
Is that would you guys agree?
Yeah, I would think so. I think family style is a great way of eating. It's the way my family grew up eating, and it's the way that I raised my family to eat. One of the things that I do want to kind of clear up, Matt, is that when I'm listening to you describe hawkers and how the food centers work, the way I see it from an outsider, I don't know what hawkers are, uh, is that it sounds like a food court, but it's not, is it? So what is the difference between a hawker center and a food court that you would find here in the United States?
I feel like with food courts in the States is the food is kind of standardized and you don't get too many different flavors. If you go to a food court at a mall in Hinesville versus a food court in Chicago, or maybe I would say Chicago, but from other cities, the food is going to be pretty similar. Versus if you go to a hawker center, one stall can be selling char kway teow. It's a popular dish here. And another stall could be right next to it selling char kway teow, but completely different flavors.
So
Each stall will have different.
I know you got to go. I'm going to interrupt you here,
Uh.
right? Because I can tell you, Saberos and Chick-fil-A taste nothing like New Chinatown, right? So if you're talking about in that perspective, I got to disagree with. In American food courts, you can find a diversity of flavors, but I think that there is a significant and fundamental difference between a hawker court, if that's what you want to call it, versus a food court. And I think that the United States is starting to move towards that type of style. But so let's refine it a little bit better, because if you look at Sbarro's, which is a pizza fast food joint, versus a Chinese fast food joint, the flavors are significantly different, right? So, what is it that makes a hawker center special?
I think what makes it special is that I feel like if you want to make that comparison, is that in the States it's more franchisees, more franchise run, whereas in Singapore it's mom and pops who've been running that same hawker stall for 20, 30, 40 years. And they're hoping to pass it on to their own kids, who they will run that same hawker stall for years and years and years. And the food is also very, very cheap and very competitive. If
I
you
have a
want to
question
do
for
well,
you.
yes,
In the hawker centers, so in American food courts, we tend to have like, you know, you have your restaurants, you have your Sparrow, you have your halal place, you have your, you know, wannabe Chinese spot. Um, uh, and you know, the lines are pretty diverse. Like people just go where they like to go. In hawker centers, would you say that social media and certain public opinion can have more of an impact on where people go? Like, would you say that more places are way more popular than others just because they've
100%.
got some limelight? Okay, how does that feel? What does that look like?
There's actually a YouTuber who's very influential in Singapore, actually. The guy's called Food King. And basically, it's just a small team of 3 to 5 people. And they will try out a bunch of individual hawker stalls. And they do a long form review of the food and what they like about it. And then each person will decide if they want to give it a 1 star or no stars. And then that adds up to a total of 3 stars, which everyone gets their 3 stars. So if one, that's because it's YouTuber. If they all say 3 stars, this place is awesome. Then that stall will, as soon as they hear about the video, plaster it on their as
So that's your
advertising.
Yelp.
Yeah.
That's your Yelp in a way.
Yeah. And it'll say Food King approved,
Mhm.
and then people will just flood the place. And then also something that's also unique to Singapore culture is they love queues. They love lines. So if they see a long line of people, they're like, oh, there must be a reason why everyone's going in. And then they'll just join it. Even if they have to wait
and that's
hours.
an
for the
opposite
food.
to American food courts, right? When often when we see long lines, we're like,
Yes.
no, I'll go
Yeah.
to Chick-fil-A. And
I-
like that's a typical thing, unless it's Starbucks, in which case we'll probably just hop in line because we don't know what good coffee tastes like. But go ahead.
No, yeah, that's a big cultural difference for me. Because my family, they're the same way. As soon as they see a line, they're like, "Oh, this place must be good," and then they'll wait out for like 2 hours plus for just a simple rice dish that might be amazing, but it might not. It might, hey, everyone just join the line just for fun. But it's like, hey, but that's part of the experience for them. Is that like, oh, at least I tried it. I got to see what everyone else is trying. But
So
for me, it's like,
culturally, it's almost important for you to go to hawkers from time to time to try out the new things in order to be relevant in conversations. Would you say? Much like
Yeah.
understanding what happened in the last baseball game might be important to major baseball areas.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
100%.
So I know we're running 2.5 hours on a 45-minute show here. Is that Matt? I'm going to wrap you up. So here's the thing: is that here's what I know about hawkers, and here's what I know about hawkers in Vietnam, and I'm going to assume that there's same in Singapore and other areas that are not quite so far along in their food regulations in Asia. What my mom cooks at home when I was young is what hawkers do in their hawker stall, right? Is that when you go inside an American food court, you're right, they're franchises. They're all standardized. They all cook the same thing when you go from mall to mall to mall. Even though the different flavor palettes are different, the restaurants are always the same. you can always expect the same flavors from it. Whereas when you go to a hawker center, you start to find different flavors of food that people really put their life and soul into. How does that tie into in plain sight? I think that one of the things that we're starting to see in the United States are these new food courts that are popping up of authentic foods where and again, we're not sponsored by anybody. Being in Atlanta, there's Ponce City Market, there's Krog City Market, and there's these different areas where they bring together these independent restaurants, not franchise or corporate restaurants, to bring their flavors, their styles, and their soul into their food. And you can go from one center to the next center, and all the foods that you taste, whether they're American, Sichuan, Italian, French, or whatever else it is, it's more akin to home cooked cooking than it is to corporate franchise cooking. And I think that's where the hawkers really stand out versus the food courts that we find in the United States. So where we connect this in the United States is that, you can find these areas where they're starting to build in, I don't know, gentrified neighborhoods, or maybe let's call them neo food courts, where they're bringing in restaurants of more authentic flavors, authentic styles, and flares that people can go into, and they can experience flavors and palates that they were never able to experience before. And despite our political differences, because in the United States, you find most of these places in liberal areas, but if you're conservative, I think you can still go in and experience food, because food is what really connects us with the rest of the world, right? With the exception of language, whether you agree with that or not. Matt, why don't you give us a last note, and then you can bail out. Andy and I will close up, and then we'll go somewhere, because we're way.
I just want to say, like, waking up at 3:30 a.m. in the morning has been worth it. I thought this was really fun, and I really enjoy sharing my own food experiences, and I hope that others, try to just take a chance and try different flavors out there, just to see if you like it or not.
Name a dish. Name a dish that you want people to try.
From Singapore or
No,
any Asian dish
Yeah.
for them to look up that they haven't probably had before. That's not Singaporean noodles.
bibimbap from Korea. I feel like it's a good entry dish. Yes. And it's rice with meat and veggie toppings on the top, with a bit of gochujang, red pepper paste. And when you eat it, you mix it all together, which I think is a fun aspect to it. And it's fun and easy to eat. The flavors is nice. It's not too out there, I feel like, for most Americans to try. And I think they should give it a shot. Bibimbap.
Matt, that was Andy's last question. My last question to you: what does food and culture mean to you, going hand in hand?
I feel like it's a window into a country's soul, and I feel like it gives you a perspective on what the people of that nation care about or are passionate about. And I think this gives you a broader perspective on life.
Sweet. Matt, thanks for joining us. I know it's 6 a.m. over there, and you
Yes.
haven't had anything. You
No.
can bail out if you want to. Andy and I are just going to wrap up real quick.